So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Head. Dr. Head received a master's in psychology and a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Toronto, Canada. She received a postdoctoral training at the University of California, Irvine. Dr. Head moved to the University of Kentucky in January 2009 and is currently a professor at the Sanders Brown Center on Aging. Dr. Head has dedicated over 18 years to the study of aging and Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. She currently co-leads a longitudinal study with Dr. Fred Schmidt in people with Down syndrome that is in its 7th year. Dr. Schmidt was supposed to be here today to co-present with Dr. Head, but unfortunately he had a death in the family, so he was unable to make it. But Dr. Head is a wonderful speaker, so we're very glad to have her here today. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I drove up last night and thankfully missed the big rainstorm on the drive in. It's about 3.5 hours, or 3 hours on my time anyways. So it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about what we're learning about aging in people with Down syndrome. And I was hoping to tell you a little bit about what our study is all about at the University of Kentucky and hopefully encourage some of you to participate. It is a study of aging, but we are also looking for people who are younger because we need to understand what changes. So we need both young and old folks to come join us. And I was going to give you a little smattering because I get asked a lot about this. What are the things we can do now to promote healthy brain aging in people, both ourselves and for our family members with Down syndrome? So I'll give you a little perusal of the literature out there, and we heard a lot about reading the literature. So I picked some of the elements I thought had the most and strongest evidence that these are things that we should consider doing. So we all know, and you've heard a couple of times today, the good news. And the good news is that people with Down syndrome are living longer and longer. And a lot of that is because we know how to help folks with Down syndrome thrive with these co-occurring illnesses, handling those, keeping those risks at bay, so people are living longer and healthier lives. But just like with all of us, the longer we live, the higher our risk is for developing Alzheimer's disease. And the same thing applies for people with Down syndrome, except they actually are a little bit higher risk than the rest of us. And that is mostly to do with the overexpression of the amyloid precursor protein, which has been mentioned before. It's on chromosome 21. And what this means is that by the age of 40 years, almost everybody who has a full extra copy of chromosome 21 will have sufficient pathology in their brains for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Now, I don't want you to go home thinking bad thoughts, though, because even though somebody may have all that pathology in their brains, that does not mean they may be showing signs of dementia. And in fact, in people with Down syndrome, there's usually at least another 10 years before we might see signs at all. And I'll show you some additional data that things are looking better and better every year. And I think, again, it's because of how our lifestyles are changing, how well we're taking care of these co-occurring illnesses, that people with Down syndrome are living longer, healthier lives and delaying that onset of dementia. And we also need to figure out which treatments we can do to really press that point home. So this is data actually back from 1993, and it's been replicated over and over again, that essentially we know that what ages do people with Down syndrome develop different Alzheimer's type changes, and I'll talk about some of those. As I mentioned, people are vulnerable to Alzheimer's disease when we have Down syndrome because of the extra copy of chromosome 21. That amyloid precursor protein gene is a long protein that gets cut into a smaller piece called beta amyloid. And that beta amyloid is what forms plaques in our brains and in the brains of people with Down syndrome. And it's a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. You need to have these plaques for this diagnosis. This is a picture of what these plaques look like in the brain of a person with Down syndrome who passed away in their 40s. On the left side, you see the blobs, the green blobs. Plaques are not really green in the brain. These are labeled to be green so we can see them. But this shows you that beta amyloid peptide, that protein in the brain, collects up into these massive plaques in between neurons. And that protein itself is very toxic to neurons. Neurons don't like it, and they'll die around there. So we get this progressive accumulation of plaques, and typically we start to see these changes already in the 30s. And there's some ways that we can see some of these changes by PET imaging now with ligands. And on the other side, you see what we call a tangle. It's also fluorescing green here. And this is a pathology that happens inside of the cells of the brain, and it leads to these knots inside of the cell, and so that cell can't function properly. So remember the pictures you saw earlier of a synapse? When you have these tangles in the neuron, that prevents these synapses from functioning well, and the neurons will eventually die as well. So we need both of these kinds of pathology for a final diagnosis of Alzheimer's for everybody. Now, as I mentioned, in Down syndrome, we know what ages we start to see these changes occur. So here's an example of the frontal cortex from some people who passed away with Down syndrome and donated their brains for research to help us understand what these changes are. And at 31 years, we can already start to see a small smattering of these plaques already, and they get progressively, and they accumulate over time as a person gets older and older. And that happens with everybody. Here's the good news. I know this doesn't sound like good news, but it is good news. And that is because we know the age of onset of these different changes in the brains of people with Down syndrome, we have the best chance possible of preventing this disease in people with Down syndrome. If you look at everybody in the general population, their age of onset of Alzheimer's disease can vary from 60 to 90 to 100 years. When would you start a prevention? You wouldn't know. And what if that prevention is a drug that has side effects and you didn't know you're going to get that disease? Would you take that drug for 20, 30, 40 years and maybe not get the disease? Here's where I think people with Down syndrome are really going to benefit, and that is we do know the age. So if we wanted to prevent Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome, and we thought these plaques were a critical part, how about we stop those plaques from forming in their 30s by finding something that will stop it in their 20s? Okay? So I feel really optimistic about this because I think we have a really good shot here in the future of being able to find not only do we have to figure out what we need to treat, but we also need to figure out when to treat it. And at different ages, if we see different things happening, different treatments might be more effective at one age and not effective at another age. So we really need to look at this in a lot of detail. Now, as I mentioned, the good news is, despite the fact that we're seeing this pathology in people with Down syndrome, when we look at the clinical signs of dementia that go along with those brain changes, what we're seeing is if you look on the x-axis on the bottom along age, you see from 35 up to over 60 years. And then on the y-axis, percent affected. You can see between the ages of 35 and 50, the chances of having dementia are actually pretty low, right? And those are the ages when we're seeing all these brain changes. So that means there's something very, very good going on in the brains of people with Down syndrome. During that time, they're compensating for this damage. And maybe some of the genes that are overexpressed on chromosome 21 are good and are helpful. Maybe we can identify which ones those are and try to promote those. And then over 50, we start to see, yes, more and more people start to show signs of dementia when they have Down syndrome. But look at those three graphs mean three different studies. Only on one of those studies does it reach 100%, and that sample size, I think, is less than 2 people. In the bigger studies, what we're seeing more and more, and everybody's commenting on this now, is people are getting older and older with Down syndrome, and they're not showing those signs of dementia. So there's actually some drift happening here, and we're trying to understand why that is. How do we identify who is going to develop dementia versus who is not going to develop dementia? So the good news is not everybody develops dementia. So this is great excitement for the field. So the overarching goal of our project at the University of Kentucky is to find out how can we prevent or slow the development of Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome. And I'll show you some pictures from some of our wonderful volunteers who gave us permission to show their pictures. But our first step is we need to understand what happens as people with Down syndrome get older, and when do things happen, so that we can understand not only what do we need to change, but when do we need to change it. So in terms of looking at aging and Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome, we're probably about 20 years behind the folks who are looking at Alzheimer's disease in the general population. We have a huge amount of catching up to do. And the good news is we're catching up very quickly because a lot of those baby steps have been done, so we can kind of jump right in there and try to understand what's happening. So our Down syndrome aging project has been going on. We're in our 7th year now, and it's been funded by the NICHD, who you heard today has been wonderfully supportive of our project. So our website's there if you want to go and take a peek. UK is revising all their websites, so it's a little stagnant right now. We're hoping to get permission updated soon. Our study involves recruiting volunteers who are 25 years and older. Okay, I know that sounds young, but we really need to understand what is typical for a person who's younger with Down syndrome and what is different when a person gets older. And in the first 5 years of our study, we were working with people who were 35 years and older, and we were seeing some changes that we didn't know if that was due to aging or if that was due to something fundamentally inherent to Down syndrome that we needed to identify. So now we're going down to 25 years. Our volunteers come in once a year. We used to do every 6 months, but now we have to spread out once a year. And they visit one of our neurologists. We have 3 outstanding neurologists. Dr. Robertson is here. He's a pediatric neurologist. He visits with our volunteers and looks at neurologic function, gets a history, talks to the family, sisters, moms, dads, brothers. And we usually get a blood sample at that point from our volunteers, not much more than what you would typically do in a doctor's visit. And those blood samples are banked, and there was a mention of biobanking. It's critically important for us to biobank as much material as possible for the purpose of collaborating, because the Down syndrome research world is actually a pretty tight-knit crew. We work a lot together. And so we're all trying to share as much of the resources as possible to reduce the burden on individual people and yet learn a whole lot. After we get a blood sample, our volunteer goes and spends some time with one of our neuropsychologists, typically Allison Cabin-Holt, and I'll show you a picture of her later, where they get to do a bunch of tests that might be drawing or mimicking actions by the neuropsychologist. And meanwhile, we are talking to the family to get information from the family. For example, have you noticed any changes? When did they start to happen? How severe are they? Was this what they were always like? We need all that information because our measures, direct measures of learning and memory in people with Down syndrome can be a little challenging for us, especially as they get older and less verbal. So we need information from the family as well. Then we spend a little bit of time taking pictures of the brain. And this is some of the information that we've been learning that has been so helpful and so exciting to us. For example, on the picture on the top, I don't have a pointer here, you can see an image from a person with Down syndrome who's 46 years of age, and a person who is the same age without Down syndrome. And you can see some rather striking differences. And that is that there's a lot more spaces here, which means that the brain is shrinking already in somebody who's 46 years old. We also see another important structure, this little structure here called the hippocampus, which is critical for memory, is shrinking also with age in people with Down syndrome. So we're trying to relate those structural changes to what we're seeing in changes in learning and memory, because they might not necessarily be predictive of each other. But more importantly, we've been looking at the connections of the brain. And we do all of these measures in one 45-minute brain scan. So we're doing multiple measures in one 45-minute scan. We've been looking at the connections of the white matter, the wiring of the brain, to see how that's changing with age. And is it telling us who's going to convert to dementia? And more recently, we've been looking at the role of the blood vessels in the brain. We know that most people with Down syndrome have these wonderful protective factors. They typically don't develop atherosclerosis or hypertension when they get older. These are risk factors we all have, and they're risk factors for stroke and for vascular dementia and for Alzheimer's disease. So in the past, we've never really looked at the blood vessels in the brain to see if there was anything happening, and it turns out there might be a lot happening here. And it's something that we're getting a little worried about. We think we're going to have to address when it comes to treatments, that simple targeted treatments might not be as big a benefit for people with Down syndrome unless we also address this other pathology that's going on in the brain. So some of the findings that we've got from our study that we've published, and here's a picture showing the brain connections from the front to the back of the brain, is that we're seeing some really important similarities between the development of Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome compared to Alzheimer's disease in the general population. But we're also finding really important differences. And those differences are going to be critical when it comes to thinking about treatments, because right now, the clinicians, when they are faced with a person developing dementia who has Down syndrome, they're using the generally approved drugs for treating Alzheimer's disease, like donepezil, memantine. It turns out there is no scientific evidence that any of those medicines work for people with Down syndrome, and they're associated with some side effects that are really unpleasant. So we're learning a lot, and we're trying to understand the biology of why this response is different, because then we can develop the right drugs. And I think these drugs are going to be specifically for people with Down syndrome. So we're also finding that a lot of the changes we predicted would be happening in the brain are happening earlier than we expected, because the literature isn't there. We're building this literature up. And so as we learn more and more, we realize some of these changes are happening even earlier than we thought, which means we need to start thinking about prevention younger, and younger. And that applies to us too. And you'll see when I come to some of the ideas on how to prevent, it's going to be a little painful. We're finding that the frontal lobes are becoming a little disconnected with age. And so what that's telling us is we might predict some of the earliest signs of dementia in people with Down syndrome might be behavioral. So behavioral changes like suddenly becoming lethargic, uninterested in hobbies, withdrawing, not talking, personality changes. And in fact, anecdotally, when you talk to families and you talk to clinicians, some of the earliest signs are exactly that. My loved one is no longer interested in going out and engaging in social activity. They're becoming very withdrawn. Sometimes you start to see an increase in aggression. So a lot of these personality changes we need to be sensitive to, because those might be our earliest signs, and we need to start getting on that sooner rather than later. So a change in memory, which might not be as obvious, might be preceded by these changes in behavior. And we think we understand why that's happening biologically. And as I mentioned, we think that the blood vessels in the brains of people with Down syndrome might be also aging. And there's some ways I think we can target that don't sound as bad as you might think. So ultimately, what we want to do is take all this information that we're learning from our volunteers, and we're following them over the years. And like I said, some people we've been following for 7 years now. We need to know what cognitive changes are going to happen, which changes happen before other changes, what personality changes happen, what brain changes happen when we look at all the structural imaging and the connections of the white matter. Then we know what measures we can use for outcome measures for clinical trials, and that was mentioned earlier, that in order for us to do a clinical trial, if we want to see if somebody's going to get better with a medicine, we need a measure that represents that person being better. Well, we don't have those completely mapped out for people with Down syndrome right now. So if you do a clinical trial, what are you going to measure? What do you expect is going to change? You need a hypothesis, what biological mechanism is going to change. Just like Randall was talking with the mice, we apply this to people. So if we wanted to target a medicine for dementia in people with Down syndrome, how do I measure whether or not they get better? In fact, it's surprisingly difficult to do. We don't have those measures really well done yet, and that's one of the purposes of this study. We try to communicate our data out as quickly as we get it. As soon as the science has been vetted and published, peer-reviewed, then we share that immediately with the community. And that is usually we send out information to our Down syndrome associations who are so engaged and helpful with us. And we give talks as much as possible. And if anybody's interested, we give tours. If you want to come see and visit us over at University of Kentucky, we'd love to have you. So we really do feel this is a two-way process. We have ideas about what we think is changing, but we need our families and our volunteers to tell us what they think is changing so we can start to measure them and capture it. And then we want to share that with other researchers around the world so that we build that database up quickly. So as I said, the implications, I think, of our work is that we really need to very, very seriously consider in the future that the treatments for Alzheimer's disease and people with Down syndrome is going to be specific for them. And I think that's why a lot of the clinical trials that we're seeing for dementia and people with Down syndrome, and there's a handful of them, and they're teeny tiny, and most of the time they don't work. So we really need to work a lot harder on this, especially since our population of people with Down syndrome who are getting older is growing and growing and growing. And we need to help take care of that. So what does this mean for families who have children with Down syndrome? And you know this is an aging talk, but there's a lot of folks who have little ones with Down syndrome. I think what we're learning is as we very, very carefully measure changes in the brain, changes in the blood, changes in behavior, we're finding some of these early signs of aging are happening younger than we first expected, which means a lot of things I'm going to tell you about next should be started as young as possible to make sure that your child thrives as they get older. We're learning a lot more about risk factors, things that you really got to stay on top of when you have little ones, because they're going to potentially get worse and worse and worse as they get older and contribute to dementia. So a really good example of that is, I don't have it listed here, is sleep apnea. Now, sleep apnea is a common problem in kids with Down syndrome. It's underdiagnosed, and I was talking to Jamie Edging, who's, I think, one of our experts in sleep apnea, and Jamie says a lot of times parents, moms and dads, don't hear it and don't recognize it in their babies. And it's there, and that constant deprivation of oxygen to the brain can lead to problems in the hippocampus, which, as I just showed you, is an early hotspot that goes down with age. So just really stay on top of all these co-occurring conditions and keep them under control. And a big one is hypothyroidism. I know it's a very common one you're all aware of. We've been surprised by how many of our volunteers are showing that their medicine is actually not tailored properly anymore. They've been on the same dose for a long time, and they're changing. So advocate to your doctor. Keep everybody checked up and make sure those values are going in the right direction. All right, so here's some kind of take-home stuff I thought you would enjoy. It's good for people with Down syndrome. It's also good for us. And we just had a superb example of successful aging, our first speaker, which gives us all hope. And it's called just keeping on top of some of these lifestyle factors that if you keep healthy on a number of these lifestyle factors, you can reduce your risk for developing Alzheimer's disease dramatically. And that applies also, and probably will apply also, to people with Down syndrome. There have been no clinical trials in any of these things yet, but I think they're pretty reasonable from all the aging and sporadic Alzheimer's disease studies that maybe these are not unreasonable to consider for ourselves and for our friends with Down syndrome. For example, keeping on top of obesity. Obesity is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. So we need to make sure obesity is under control and trying to keep type 2 diabetes under control. Both are considered to be very big risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. If your heart's not working well, then your brain's not going to work well. So keeping on top of all the different conditions associated with heart dysfunction. As I mentioned, obstructive sleep apnea is another big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And that definitely does apply in Down syndrome. And as we go, and as all these studies start to come to fruition, and as the meetings come together, there's a big meeting in June in Chicago for the International Society, we all compare notes and we talk amongst ourselves about all these things we're finding in clinic. An example being that we've been finding people in our study tend to be vitamin D deficient. That's a biggie. Got to keep on top. That's another one that we're trying to pool all this information, and we're going to hopefully come to a point where we can make some standards for doctors to pay attention to. Families bring to their doctors, say, we need to look for these things to make sure my loved one is staying healthy. You heard a lot about antioxidants, I'm sure, in your reading of the web, of the big Google machine, saying that antioxidants are very good for people with Down syndrome because of the overexpression of a number of genes that lead to increased oxidative stress. And there's some very good data in the literature suggesting that antioxidant supplements per se may not be helpful in preventing Alzheimer's disease in people. However, having a good diet rich in antioxidants has the biggest benefit. And these are things that you can easily do. For example, the Mediterranean diet. This is a great diet that's been shown over and over again to have benefits for preventing Alzheimer's disease in the general population. And again, there's no clinical trials in people with Down syndrome yet, but it's a very good food, a good diet with lots of antioxidants. Again, I'm trying to think about reduce obesity, keep healthy, eat lots of fruits and vegetables, exercise. This is the painful one. There's tons and tons of data that people who exercise are protected from Alzheimer's disease. And that's probably associated with reductions in obesity and improvements in cardiovascular function. But there's an added benefit of exercise. And I know one day we wish there would be a pill for this. But one of the benefits of doing exercise is that you can actually lead to more neurons growing in your brain. And here's some example from a mouse that was exercised, and this is the hippocampus, that area important for memory, and it's growing new neurons because that mouse was allowed to run on a treadmill. So, and there is an active set of labs trying to find the exact protein. We think we know the protein is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, but try to do that in a pill so that we don't have to actually do the exercise. But I think that's going to miss the mark. So, and another really good thing to keep in mind, and I know this is something I think our Downs associations have been absolutely phenomenal with, and families have been phenomenal with, is keeping active cognitively, and that's both from children all the way through adolescence to old age. The more active your brain is, the more of those connections that we're going to get, the ones that we're measuring in our study, more neurons are going to grow and make more connections. And those neurons are going to be happier because they're going to release growth factors. And so if we have a lot of Alzheimer's pathology in the brain and yet our neurons are still growing and still active, you might actually be able to compensate for that damage for a long time. And in fact, the evidence suggests that the higher level of education you have, the more protected from Alzheimer's you are because you have more reserve. So again, activity, keeping active socially. That's a big one too, which we all love to do. That's an easy, fun one to do. Is the people who are more socially active, more engaged, tend to be protected from Alzheimer's disease. So, and the reason for that, again, is biological. And that is the more social you are, the more you engage in activities and are with people, the more connections you make in your brain, and the more compensation you have if there's damage there. It's not going to completely reverse, but it's good. It's going to help you as you get older because you want to prevent these changes. So I think the future for understanding and preventing Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome is going to be very, very good. There's a number of studies that are looking at treatments, trying to stop or reverse Alzheimer's disease in people with Down syndrome as they get older. And they're going to have the same challenges as trying to stop or treat Alzheimer's disease in the general population. And that is sometimes when the disease is too far along, it's really hard to bring that brain back. So we really need to target prevention. And we have to be very, very careful that when you look at clinical trials, right now there's a lot of clinical trials going on for people with Down syndrome that are literally the drugs and the approaches taken for sporadic Alzheimer's disease being put and tested for people with Down syndrome, which is a perfectly good idea. But as we're learning more and more about the differences, we need to be a little bit more careful about that. So ask a lot of questions and read the literature. Most importantly, I think, is be positive. The more positive your attitude, too, there is lots of data out there, scientific evidence, that the more positive you are, the more protected you are for some of these age-associated changes. So these are all things that you can do today, right now, tomorrow, that are going to be beneficial for brain aging. And as we go a little further along with all of our colleagues around the world and we get to the point of doing clinical trials, we'll have some good ideas in mind and when to start, what to try, and what things to measure as a sign of improvement. So I think the future does look really, really bright. So I'm hoping you can help us. If any of you are interested in our study and want to join our team, we really do need you. We have about 80 people now, but we need more. Roberta is the lovely smiling lady up the top who also couldn't make it this trip. And she may be known to some of you, is our recruiter. She'll help give you information. And at the bottom, there's Miss Katie. She is the person that walks through the entire visit and stays with our family through the whole day. And this is Dr. Schmidt. He usually is smiling more than this. He was trying to look all serious for this picture. He's my partner in crime. Fred and I have been working together for a lot of years. And this is Dr. Cabin-Holt. Allison is one of our neuropsychological testers. And this is Dr. Jaika, who's a neurologist who's an expert in Alzheimer's disease dementia. He's our Alzheimer's Center neurologist who sees some of our volunteers and talks with our families. So with that, I will end and see if there's any questions later, I guess.